This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan. It is an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. Oh boy, we need some of that today, don't we? Remember, before we get into it, leave us a good rating and write a review. The reviews, as I've been saying, they really do help. I put links in the show notes so that it's really easy for you to find us. The Apple one is a big one. There are a couple other apps that allow you to write a review. It really does help to get the word out so more people can participate in the conversation. Like the one we'll be exploring today on an issue that's been riling up a lot of people, including me. But my question is, have you ever spoken to one of them? You know, them, one of those people. What I mean is people that are on a supposed different side of an issue or a series of events or a political campaign. And I'll be totally candid. Today I was going to talk about the campus protests we've seen all over the country and in fact all over the world. We've seen encampments and outbreaks of violence and examples of a number of kids showing their ass, as one of my friends likes to say, basically acting out in ways that most of them will look back on and be pretty embarrassed about in 15 or 20 years. But that's a problem. I mean, I'm a part of the problem because I was going to go all in and call this edition of TP&R. Campus protesters are more akin to January 6th insurrectionists than Biden Democrats. Campus protesters akin to January 6th insurrectionists. Pretty catchy, and that would sure piss everyone off, from my Trump supporting friends to many of those who are sympathetic to the pro-Palestinian protests. And I'm sure, it would have gotten a lot of clicks. But what I realize is that's perpetuating a tendency that I've been talking about on this program for a long time. My gig is not to be a conflict entrepreneur. My objective is to try and do this thing better. And what I realized is that I haven't actually spoken to one of them. No, I have no interest in speaking to some of the extremists. The many examples I'm sure a lot of us have seen on the news of kids who either have no idea what they're protesting about or are acting in, I'll just say it, flat out stupidly hypocritical ways. And that, by the way, is part of the problem. Much of the media we're consuming is prone to engage in what we'd call nut picking. We've talked about it before. It's just tempting to put up video of the kid whose identity is completely concealed, screaming for liberation for Palestine, and commandeering an entire area, inhibiting other students from just going to their classes, and and to top it off, even demanding that no bananas be brought within a 100-yard radius of her due to her extreme sensitivity, even to the smell of bananas or something like that. I'm not making this up. This is an actual thing. And let's face it, it's the sort of stupidity and hypocrisy. It's juicy and kind of funny and just weird and thus newsworthy. Or so the calculation goes. Nut picking or banana picking. I don't know. Pick out some extreme examples or outlandish incidents or outlandish characters and make the whole story about the nuts. But this is one of many instances when the nut-picking style of covering a story or an issue just doesn't do a complex issue or any of us any favors. So instead of just going off on the college protesters and all the related issues, whether it's the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly, being given an opportunity for the redress of grievances, another part of the First Amendment, or the proper limitations of these freedoms, such as time, place, and manner restrictions, the effectiveness of these protests, what the actual impact of these demonstrations or movements typically have, let alone the issues themselves, the issues underlying the protest, which is interesting in and of itself, that so much of the talk around what's happening on college campuses isn't about Israel, Palestine, so much as about the students, the nature of these gatherings, the conflicts between students and administrations and protesters and police. And I'll cover a lot of that. But first, what I'd like to try and do, I'd like to try and do what I think someone like Yasha Monk did really well in his book from last year, The Identity Trap, or a great writer, E.J. Dionne. He does so well in a lot of his columns, and that's try and articulate a fair representation of what many of the folks who are protesting, the vast majority of them, I gather, the ones who don't necessarily, they're not the nuts, they're not the ones who make the headlines. What are they protesting about? What are their concerns? And what are they trying to achieve? So along those lines, I did speak with someone who was on the ground, who participated in at least one. She probably got involved in a few in her region. And this is someone I consider a dear friend. We don't always agree, as you'll see here, but I trust this person, value her friendship, and I know and she's an incredibly principled, admirable, thoughtful human being. So this friend was telling me about a visit that she made to Colombia, which is, as a lot of folks know, the center of a lot of controversy. And she participated in what was happening within the encampments on that campus, not for the entire time, but she's been there. So it's worth sharing what some of her observations were. She shared that her experience was part of an entirely peaceful demonstration. Everything that she's seen has been entirely peaceful. And she was among a diverse number of people, including many Jewish people. In fact, and she knows I'm Jewish. She said she participated in Shabbat services on a Friday night, along with alongside Jewish friends within the encampment. And she even participated in a Seder, which for folks who don't know, that's one of my favorite times of year when we do our Passover Seder. That's the traditional dinner ritual that Jews observe, retelling the Exodus story for Passover. She also gave me resources to better understand what the protests are actually about, what most of the people participating in them are there for. So some of the things I learned is what they're actually trying to achieve, what their demands are. One of the resources I looked into involves a group called If Not Now, which you can follow on Instagram and Threads at ifnotnow.org. And they're a community organization of Jewish students supporting campus protests for Gaza. And I'd encourage you to read their open letter. It's pinned to the top of their IG feed. And like me, you might not agree with everything they say, to say the least, let alone, like anything that's said in the letter, but at least you'll come away with a better understanding, a somewhat better understanding. So among a lot of other subject matter that's packed into the letter, they have demands. So I thought it'd be good to summarize what are in the demands. Number one is divestment. It's a term some folks might have heard here recently. Divestment meaning universities have, in this case, they have endowments that are basically like large investment funds. The demand for divestment refers to any ties the university or their endowments have to companies that are contributing in any way to the assault on Gaza. That's their wording. Different groups might word this in different ways, using terms like apartheid, genocide, and other ways of referring to what's happening in Israel. Another demand in this open letter has to do with amnesty for all nonviolent student protesters, meaning students who participate in these protests should be immune from threats from administrations and law enforcement, from jail time to expulsion from the school or even suspension. But I do note, it's worth noting that they specify non-violent student protesters. So maybe even they're self-aware enough to know that there's some wiggle room in the distinction to acknowledge the fact that, some folks who have participated in what's happening have just, like I said, shown their asses. But I'll get into more of that in a minute. Their other demand is for, and I'll just quote this one in full. They say, "We demand that academic and political leaders stop misrepresenting and demonizing protests and their organizers. protect the voices of student activists, and take immediate action to stop Israel's genocidal acts before more Palestinians are killed. Okay, so while I strongly disagree with some of the premises, and frankly, there's some of this, it's hard to take seriously, like the, civil disobedience involves accepting the consequences of one's actions. So the whole part about amnesty, I don't know. I mean, again, maybe there's some wiggle room between nonviolent student protesters and other, other folks who are pulling some more nasty shenanigans. So anyway, I strongly believe in these groups' rights, including their freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the rights to have their grievances heard. I want to go back. So that's a balance. Like, I strongly disagree with them, while at the same time strongly believing in their right to protest. So I'm reminded of the famous Supreme Court case from the late 70s, National Socialist Party of America versus Village of Skokie. And for those who might not remember or aren't familiar, basically there was this neo-Nazi group that was petitioning to march and have a gathering in Skokie, Illinois. Skokie, especially at that time in the 70s, was home to many, many Jewish people, not just Jewish people, but in particular survivors of the Holocaust. So as you can imagine, having people, shouting these anti-Semitic slogans and wearing swastika armbands and, dressed in, their Hitler-esque costumes. This was so egregious that as a village, as a town, they didn't want to have to suffer these things. They didn't want to have to suffer, which reminds me, by the way, there's been this a complete misunderstanding, a complete warping of the idea of free expression and living in a pluralistic society and free speech. And that's the idea of words as violence, that students would protest and disrupt so loudly when somebody that they disagreed with was, going to have a talk on their campus, even like just conservative judges. And it's just one of these forms of hypocrisy that's given me such a bad taste in my mouth for a lot of folks, their lack of understanding of what it means to live in a pluralistic society. But there are some times when it's more understandable than others. For example, I had my niece on here a couple of years ago, or maybe it was 3 years ago now, that discussed the fact that the San Francisco State University was going to have a convicted terrorist, not just a one-time terrorist, but a two-time terrorist. So, while that particular university was open to having terrorists, they would succumb to other student groups who didn't like, a Republican figure coming to speak to another group, of conservative students. So there is a hypocrisy there, a lack of understanding, and I'll get to that in a second. It goes to, I place a lot of culpability in the universities themselves that are having some of the worst outbreaks of this. But going back to the National Socialist Party of America versus Village of Skokie, what was remarkable about that case was this neo-Nazi group was represented by the Anti-Defamation League. Not only that, they were specifically represented by Jewish lawyers. And in documentaries I've seen that interview the lawyers who represented that group, they made the really profound point that the freedom of speech isn't tested when we agree with that speech. The freedom of speech is tested when we strongly, passionately disagree with it. That's when we have to protect those citizens' rights, their First Amendment rights. And part of the theory, which proved to be correct, is let them speak, because if they're given a platform, they'll be seen to be just as clownish as they actually are, just as idiotic and hateful and let the weight of their own idiocy and hypocrisy and hatefulness sink them. Our silencing of that speech doesn't do that nearly as well as their own speech itself. Like I say, let Marjorie Taylor Greene speak. Every time she opens her mouth, she just proves how much of a freaking idiot she is. Let her speak, and eventually she'll get 1/435th of 1/2 of 1/3 of, the federal government's attention. I hope that's the case sooner rather than later, if she's elected again. But that's a whole other question. So again, I agree with these students and these groups' rights to free speech and free assembly and redress of grievances. At the same time, there are time, place, and manner restrictions. So what do I mean by that? In the First Amendment, we've talked a lot about in recent weeks and months, the First Amendment, the rights that are articulated in the First Amendment. Case law has also, over time, meted out the balance to that, how we live this out in a pluralistic society. So time, place, and manner is, I'll just break it down for you. There's a really great resource. It's an article that I'll link in the show notes. But basically what that's referring to is imposing limits on the noise level of speech, capping the number of protesters who may occupy a given forum, barring early morning or late evening demonstrations, and restricting the size or placement of signs on government property. David French, in his April 28th column titled "Colleges Have Gone Off the Deep End, There Is a Way Out," he refers to it, and I'll quote from his piece: "Reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions are indispensable in this context. Time, place, and manner restrictions are content-neutral legal rules that enable a diverse community to share the same space and enjoy equal rights." Now, again, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give a fair, instead of nitpicking or giving a really one-dimensional summary reference to points of view that I disagree with. I'm really trying here to give compelling arguments from the quote-unquote other side, because I did talk to my friend in depth about this. I did look into some of the resources that she provided me. I did try to understand this more fully. And one of the more compelling arguments that I heard was Bernie Sanders on the Senate floor, who cited an act of the act of nonviolent protest on the part of Black folks who just sat at lunch counters in the 60s, that in the segregated South, as you'll remember, those lunch counters were reserved for white people only. And his analogy was that they were taking up space. The act of taking up space was an act of protest, an act of civil disobedience. This is a really compelling justification for these encampments, taking up space. They had to be recognized. And in their point of view, they're taking up space as an act of protest that they would have to be reckoned with. So again, reckoning with the best arguments, and this, frankly, is one of them. And my friend made the point that disruption is the point, that if protesters haven't disrupted, they haven't done anything. So, obviously I have lots of issues and disagreements with this premise, including the assumption, frankly, that people should care about these things, that my friend saying, well, people should care about this because it's, in her view, it's genocide and people should care about it. And listen, it's not to say that these aren't important issues, but every cause, every protest, every group believes that their issue, their cause is important. And I'm not trying to diminish the seriousness of what's happening in Israel and in Gaza, but the larger point is that we're a pluralistic society with many different people who don't all care about the same things equally. Some kids at Columbia, UCLA, or I don't know, UT Austin just want to get to their math class or their art history class or their post-Hegelian philosophy class. So the result of these occupations on that student isn't one of persuasion so much as inconvenience or annoyance, or blocking the bridges isn't about persuasion when I'm trying to get my elderly mother to the doctor. And I'll just say it, it's like a low grade form of terrorism, and that's where you lose me. So I'm going to quote again at length from David French's essay in the Times from April 28th. He says, the simplest way of outlining the ideal university policy toward protest is to say that it should protect free speech, respect civil disobedience, and uphold the rule of law. That means universities should protect the rights of students and faculty members on a viewpoint neutral basis, and they should endeavor to make sure that every member of the campus community has the same access to campus facilities and resources. That also means showing no favoritism among competing ideological groups in access to classrooms, in the imposition of campus penalties, in the imposition of campus penalties, and in access to educational opportunities. All groups should have equal rights to engage in the full range of protected speech, including by engaging in rhetoric that's hateful to express and painful to hear. Public chants like globalize the intifada may be repugnant to many ears, but they're clearly protected by the First Amendment at public universities and by policies protecting free speech and academic freedom at most private universities. So, that's basically that. I said it a few weeks ago. I'm a French Davidian. I'm not left. I'm not right. I'm a French. It's great. Some writers just have a way of really distilling and giving me a vocabulary to better articulate what I'm thinking, what I'm leaning towards. They obviously, in French's case, he has greater experience, greater education about such issues. He argued some of the monumental free speech cases throughout the last, 2-3 decades. So, yeah, that summarizes what I believe. So they're occupying the quad. These encampments are occupying the quad. But if that's a public university, or even in most private universities, what about a group of students who have family, friends, or just one step removed from folks who have family and friends who were killed on October 7th? Do they have access, equal access to that place on the university campus? I mean, that's a fair question. Not to mention the fact that the cause you so strongly believe in, what if you're wrong? What if there are aspects of this fight that you're engaged in where you have it wrong? Now, even if you're wrong, I still believe in your right to free speech and free assembly. But this should be considered. Maybe you're not on the right side of history. Now, we can look back at young people at lunch counters. We can all look back on that and say they were on the right side of history, and we know who was on the wrong side in that equation. But when it comes to these protests, you know what's not mentioned? What I haven't seen acknowledged, except in the worst ways that you could imagine, as if it's celebrated, is what I was just talking about. October 7th. October 7th. October 7th happened. Hundreds of civilians lost their lives in the worst ways possible. That happened. And as much as I have major concerns about the way that Netanyahu has executed this war, and I could still do that. I could still be pro-Israel, pro-Israel's right to exist. As a person from a Jewish family, in favor of my family having a place to live peacefully in the Middle East, and to have a working democracy there, I can at the same time have serious concerns with Netanyahu and how he's gone about this war since October 7th. I can have serious concerns about whether he and his cronies in Israel's government value democracy, the kind of democracy that we believe in here, the American experiment, the American version of it, and or democratic principles, more universal democratic principles, because that's highly questionable. That's where we can have a really robust conversation. But where we can have a robust conversation is, and maybe this is I've fallen prey to the nut picking, but kids who are celebrating, wearing T-shirts with that have these terrorists with parachutes, the ones that parachuted into the music festival, where kids were brutally murdered, brutally raped, brutally tortured, and many more were taken hostage. Arguably, many of them who were taken hostage are sadly not living. That my extended family, we were afraid that he was taken hostage. We later came to find out that he died. He also died on October 7th. But this, either way, whether my understanding of that is part of the nut picking or not, I'm certainly not hearing. I've sat in on interviews with Muslim scholars, Palestinian scholars, Muslim Palestinian scholars, Christian Muslim scholars, even one of the renowned professors, Palestinian professors at Columbia. And I just, it's not their responsibility. They're necessarily to mention October 7th and how awful that was, because they need to advocate for their beliefs and their families and their causes. So I understand that. I'm not going to say, hey, you have to utter these words every time you open your mouth or talk about this subject. But it would be nice. Actually, let me back up. I will say that my conversations with the person I was referring to, there's a sensitivity there. She understands I have family in Israel. She understands my own sensitivities. In fact, she's one of the first people who called me after October 7th just to check in and see how I was doing. We had a really loving conversation after that. So that's why she's earned a lot of runway with me, is that she always remembers my humanity, not just my experience, but my family's experience, and appreciates the fact that I have a different perspective because of my family's history, and because of our experience, and because of my cousins who are there. So we respect each other's humanity, yet we still passionately disagree on some of this, and okay, so I'll also say, I alluded to it earlier, that I hold the universities largely culpable, that there are many universities who've been cultivating this complete lack of understanding, that cultivating a sense of entitlement as opposed to the balance between our freedoms and our responsibilities, cultivating this sense of grievance without that sense of citizenship, without that sense of engaging in ways that enhance who we are as a pluralistic democracy. That there's this sense that only one side is right and one side is wrong, and everybody should agree with you. But again, maybe they're wrong. But it's on the universities. In large cases, if anyone should understand that what is meant by those 5 freedoms in the First Amendment, and I can't mention them enough, but 3 in particular: the redress of grievances, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly in this case. I guess the other freedoms are touched upon here as well, but the balance, as well as the case law. A lot of these universities have renowned law schools, so understanding time, place, and manner restrictions, and cultivating in their students the right to protest, the right to freely assemble, while also understanding their responsibilities of how to do so, how to have their voices heard, while allowing for the fact that there are other students there, there's other administration there, viewpoint diversity, which has largely been lost. And I really appreciate contributions from folks like John Rausch in his Constitution of Knowledge a couple of years ago, and Yasha Monk in The Identity Trap, how they're talking more and more about that. John Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, the work that they did several years ago, and that Lukianoff continued with his recent book about allowing for viewpoint diversity. But here's the other thing, too, to ask about these protests is I mentioned earlier about what is the effectiveness of these protests. And I'm here to tell you, man, like, the blocking the bridges, the disrupting students' ability to simply go to class. If disruption is the point, I don't think you're achieving the goals that you want of getting other folks to see the points that you're trying to make, and attaining a level of sympathy, if not alliance with that cause. So I also looked into certain historical patterns that have been discussed by several writers and scholars here recently. Comparisons have been made to 1968, the protests that occurred on campuses throughout 1968. Well, one should consider, number one, a lot of those protests had to do with Vietnam, and Vietnam continued well into 1974. So that needs to be considered. Were they effective at ending the war? Obviously not. Not only that, it is an arguable fact. One can make the argument that they did more harm than good, because what happened in 1968? Was a Democrat elected? No. Nixon was elected in a landslide, and an even greater landslide was reelected in 1972. And after Carter's administration, you had 2 terms of Reagan and another term of George H.W. Bush. So 1968 led arguably to a period, the most conservative period that we've seen in the last 50, if not 100 years. So another piece that was helpful, another David, one of my favorite David writers, David Brooks, as folks know, who's on this program a few months ago. And in Brooks's May 2nd piece from the Times, he said, he was talking about this historical pattern. He said, Brooks said, for his latest book, If We Burn, the progressive journalist Vincent Bevins investigated 10 protest movements that occurred between 2010 and 2020. So this is recent history. In places like Egypt, Turkey, Brazil, Ukraine, and Hong Kong. He concluded that in 7 of those cases, the results were worse than failure. Things went backward. So yeah, I mean, just off the top of my head, the Arab Spring, I was very encouraged by those initial protests, but which led to Hosni Mubarak stepping down. But within 2 years, what happened? The Muslim Brotherhood took over. So in the near term, those protests had just the opposite effect that they were intended for. So obviously it's a complex issue. I did want to get into it and do a little bit more of a nuanced account. My main exercise here was giving voice to the other side, if you will, to the fact that I was going to dive into this with all critique and all sharp elbows, but I thought it's really important to contend with the best arguments from one of them. So again, I go back to the original point. Instead of just launching off and indulging in these critiques, which I was going to do, I was just going to, make that comparison and tease it out between campus protesters and January 6th insurrectionists. But it occurred to me, have you ever spoken to one of them? One of the folks that you think you disagree with? So I decided to ask a dear friend who I know has been at these protests. And I still come out the other side with a lot of the same view on this. Because obviously writers and thinkers like David Brooks and David French resonate a heck of a lot more. I find their arguments and their positions a lot more persuasive than I do with the students who are continuing to occupy, continuing with their encampments, continuing with some of the uglier forms of these protests. But at least I better understand it. At least I better understand what they are insisting on, what their demands are. What the thinking behind it is. And that's a better place to be able to engage and have conversations that lead to something more positive, more productive, more of a lasting peace. We can still hold our differences as well as the complexity of these issues that we face. And I thought it might be worthwhile to kind of wrap it up just by quoting the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble or to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And again, I'll just remind folks that case law has proven out the value and of how to work out these freedoms with responsibility through time, place, and manner restrictions. And again, I'll put the links to the there's a good summary of time, place, and manner restrictions in the on the Free Speech Center a website that I'll link, as well as the David French and David Brooks columns that I quoted from. I don't know if that's made anything more clear for anybody. I hope, if nothing else, you heard a little bit more from my friend's point of view and others' point of view. Hopefully, you'll be more inclined to, before racing to judgment and throwing rocks at positions that you haven't fully heard out, perhaps you'll consider that possibility and seek out a more level-headed voice on an issue from someone that you disagree with. Not online. That's typically not a good place to do it. I made a point of, hopping on a Zoom with this person and talking to them face to face. Certainly, it's helpful if it is somebody that you have a relationship with. So hopefully, if nothing else, that'll be a takeaway. I still feel very strongly, however, have at least a better understanding of where some folks are coming from. So that's where I'll leave it. And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, remember to follow this show. Write that review. Go ahead and write. Go to Apple, write it. We're stuck at about 112 right now. So if you could do me that favor and go write that review. If you think I'm completely full of crap, give me a 1-star because every bit helps. And then I'll just ask a bunch of friends to leave 5 stars to cover it up. But every bit helps, and I do appreciate constructive criticism. So write that review and tell somebody about Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. We are growing like crazy. We had our highest download month ever. I mean, I lapped myself. April, we ended up lapping our highest. So it was double what I had done previously with this program, which is not what I had done, what we had done. So that's really cool. It's really encouraging to see those numbers because I am competitive. I'm a little bit of what my brother and I call a red ass. I like the numbers. I like scoreboard. I like to see things moving in the right direction in terms of including more people in this conversation. So tell a friend about Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. We are easy to recommend. Tell them to go to their favorite podcast app and type in Without Killing Each Other. And the killing is without the G, Without Killing Each Other. And you'll find our big purple logo. You can find me online at Corey S. Nathan. That's Corey with an E and S as in Sam, at Corey S. Nathan. Now, go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.